Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the shadows of 9th century Rome, where the marble halls of the Vatican echo with whispers of decay and the sweet stench of rotting flesh mingles with incense. Picture this. It's a sweltering summer evening in 896 AD, and somewhere in the papal apartments, a man lies dying. His name is Pope Formosus, literally meaning handsome in Latin, though here is nothing beautiful about what's about to unfold. As his final breath rattles through the corridors of St. Peter's Basilica, Formosus has no idea that his death is merely the opening act in history's most grotesque ecclesiastical horror show. So if you're into strange and fascinating tales from history, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. To understand why a dead pope would later find himself literally put on trial, we need to rewind the clock and examine the political cesspit that was 9th century Rome. The papal throne wasn't just a religious seat, it was the ultimate prize in a deadly game of musical chairs played by Italy's most powerful families. Pope Formosus hadn't exactly won his position through divine intervention. He'd clawed his way to the top through a combination of political maneuvering, strategic alliances, and more than a few convenient deaths among his rivals. The man who would succeed him, Stephen VI, watched this ascension with the patience of a vulture circling carrion. Medieval Rome was a city where allegiances shifted faster than morning shadows, and where today's ally could become tomorrow's corpse with little more than a whispered accusation. The Spoleto family, powerful Italian nobles, had their fingers deep in papal politics, while the Byzantine Empire and the Holy Roman Empire pulled strings from afar like puppet masters in a macabre theatre. Formosus had made the fatal mistake of playing multiple sides against each other. He'd crowned Lambert of Spoleto as Holy Roman Emperor, then later invited Arnulf of Carinthia to invade Italy and claim the same title. It was the medieval equivalent of promising your hand in marriage to two different suitors and hoping they'd never meet at the altar. When Lambert died in a hunting accident, though historians debate whether arrows really do fly accidentally when aimed by skilled hunters, Formosus thought he dodged a political bullet. He was wrong. The dead have long memories in Rome, and their families have even longer ones. Stephen VI, who would become Pope Stephen VI in May 896, had been personally appointed as Bishop of Anagni by none other than Formosus himself. This detail would later prove deliciously ironic, like being murdered by your own protege with the very knife you'd given them for protection. Stephen represented the Spoleto faction's interests, and he'd spent years watching Formosus play his dangerous political games with the calculating patience of a spider waiting for a fly to tire itself out in its web. The scholarly consensus suggests that Stephen VI was likely already planning his revenge, while Formosus still drew breath, though some historians argue that the events that followed were born of spontaneous rage rather than calculated malice. As Formosus lay dying in the 8th of April 96, he probably imagined his legacy would be debated by theologians and political scholars for generations. He was right, though not in the way he'd hoped. Instead of being remembered for his papal bulls or religious reforms, he'd become history's most famous posthumous defendant in a trial that would redefine the very concept of ecclesiastical justice. The irony is that Formosus, whose name meant beautiful, would soon be remembered for participating in the ugliest spectacle medieval Christianity had ever witnessed. But death, as Stephen VI would soon demonstrate, was no escape from papal politics in medieval Rome. Not even the grave offered sanctuary from the machinations of ambitious clergy and vengeful nobles. The Vatican's crypts held more than just the bones of saints. They harbored the raw materials for revenge. Stephen VI understood this better than most. He'd learned from watching Formosus that in papal politics your enemies don't stop being dangerous just because they stop breathing. They simply become more creative in their methods of retaliation. As the funeral bells tolled for Pope Formosus, they were really announcing the opening ceremony for the most macabre trial in Christian history. Stephen VI was about to prove that in the eternal city, death was just another political tool, and corpses could be just as eloquent as living witnesses when properly motivated. The stage was set, the principal player was conveniently deceased, and the audience of Roman nobles was already sharpening their appetites for the feast of revenge that was about to unfold. Little did they know that Stephen VI's definition of consuming his enemies would prove more literal than anyone had bargained for. 9 months passed like a fever dream in the papal apartments, with Stephen VI's obsession growing more virulent with each passing day, while Rome's citizens went about their daily routines of trading, praying, and dodging the occasional street brawl. Their new pope was crafting a plan so audacious that it would make Caligula himself raise an eyebrow. The winter of 896 had been particularly harsh, and as spring approached in 897, Stephen VI made a decision that would echo through the corridors of ecclesiastical history like a scream in a cathedral. He would put his predecessor on trial. The fact that Formosus had been decomposing in his marble tomb for the better part of a year was in Stephen's mind merely a logistical challenge rather than an insurmountable obstacle. After all, if Christ could rise from the dead, surely a pope could manage to show up for his own trial. The mechanics of exhuming a 9-month-old corpse in medieval Rome were surprisingly well established, though typically reserved for accusations of heresy or sainthood investigations, rather than political revenge fantasies. Stephen VI dispatched his most trusted clerics to the papal crypts with instructions that would have made grave robbers blush with embarrassment. They were to retrieve Pope Formosus, dress him in full papal regalia, and prepare him for what historians would later call the Cadaver Synod, though at the time Stephen simply referred to it as settling old scores. The exhumation took place under cover of darkness, because even in medieval Rome there were limits to what the public would tolerate during daylight hours. The papal gravediggers worked by torchlight, their faces wrapped in cloth, soaked with wine and herbs to mask the stench of their unholy task. What they unearthed was a horror that would have tested the stomach of the most hardened battlefield surgeon. Formosus had not aged gracefully in his marble bed. 9 months of decay had transformed the once handsome pope into something that resembled a leather puppet left too long in the rain. His flesh had taken on the consistency of wet parchment, and his famous papal robes had become a second skin of mould and corruption. Yet Stephen VI's men dutifully dressed this nightmare in fresh papal vestments, complete with the sacred pallium and papal ring, as if preparing him for a particularly macabre Easter service. Some historians debate whether the corpse was actually capable of sitting upright during the trial, while others argue that medieval embalming techniques might have preserved enough structural integrity for the spectacle Stephen had in mind. The truth, as usual in medieval chronicles, lies somewhere between complete decomposition and miraculous preservation. What we know for certain is that on a cold January morning in 897, the doors of the Lateran Palace swung open to admit the most unusual defendant in legal history. Formosus was carried into the great hall on a portable throne, his skull crowned with the papal tiara, his skeletal fingers wrapped around a cerro. The assembled crowd of bishops, cardinals, and Roman nobles who had gathered for this unprecedented spectacle found themselves face to face with their own mortality made manifest. Here was papal authority literally decaying before their eyes, yet still dressed in all the symbols of divine power. Stephen VI had orchestrated this moment with the theatrical flair of a master showman and the vindictiveness of a spurned lover. He understood that, in medieval politics, imagery was everything, and nothing conveyed his message quite like forcing Rome's elite to confront the rotting reality behind papal pretensions. The irony wasn't lost on the more educated observers that they were witnessing a pope literally putting death itself on trial, as if Stephen could somehow prosecute the grave for stealing his predecessor before he'd finished settling their political differences. The formal charges against Formosus were read aloud by Stephen VI himself, his voice echoing through the vaulted chamber with a kind of theatrical projection that suggested he'd been rehearsing this moment for months. The dead pope was accused of perjury, of violating canon law by moving from one bishopric to another, and of crowning an unworthy emperor in Lambert of Spoleto. Each accusation was delivered with the precise diction of a man who believed he was participating in divine justice, rather than orchestrating an elaborate puppet show with a corpse. But Stephen VI's masterstroke was yet to come. He had appointed a deacon to serve as Formosus's defense attorney, a young cleric who had drawn the shortest straw in what was undoubtedly the most unwanted legal assignment in Christian history. This unfortunate soul was expected to speak for the dead, to channel the voice of his decomposing client, and to somehow mount a coherent defense against charges that had been specifically crafted to be unanswerable. The deacon stood beside the throne where Formosus's remains were propped up like a grotesque marionette, and in a voice that trembled with either divine inspiration or sheer terror, he began to speak for the dead. The trial had officially begun, and Rome was about to witness justice served with a side of decomposition. The young deacon appointed to defend the rotting pontiff cleared his throat with the nervous energy of a man who'd just realized he was arguing a case where his client's jaw might literally fall off mid-testimony. His name was Benedict, and he possessed the kind of earnest theological training that prepared him for debates about transubstantiation, but left him woefully unprepared for ventriloquism with decomposing papal remains. Standing beside Formosus's throne, Benedict began his defense with the traditional legal preamble, though his voice carried the distinctive quaver of someone trying very hard not to think about the smell emanating from his silent client. "Your Holiness," he addressed Stephen Veit, "Pope Formosus cannot answer these charges because he has passed into God's eternal judgment, where earthly accusations hold no power." It was a reasonable opening gambit, appealing to the fundamental Christian belief that death offered passage beyond human jurisdiction. Stephen Veit's response revealed the depth of his theatrical preparation and his complete abandonment of theological reason. He leaned forward in his papal throne, his eyes gleaming with the fervour of a man who'd convinced himself he was conducting divine business, rather than staging an elaborate revenge. "The dead," Stephen proclaimed, with the authority of someone who'd clearly spent considerable time working out his legal theories, carry the stain of their earthly sins until justice has been properly served. Pope Formosus sits before us, not as a corpse, but as a defendant whose crimes demand earthly resolution before his soul can find peace. The assembled bishops and cardinals exchanged glances that ranged from theological confusion to barely concealed horror, though none dared interrupt Stephen's increasingly creative interpretation of canon law. The scholarly debate over whether Stephen Veit actually believed his own theological justifications, or was simply using religious language to legitimize political revenge, continues to fascinate historians. Stephen Benedict, realizing that conventional legal arguments were falling on ears that had apparently decided to suspend both logic and the basic laws of decomposition, shifted his strategy toward the technical irregularities of the proceeding itself. "Your Holiness," he ventured, "the accused cannot take an oath, cannot cross-examine witnesses, and cannot present evidence. How can justice be served when the fundamental requirements of canonical trial procedure cannot be met?" Stephen Veit's answer demonstrated the kind of creative legal thinking that would have impressed Machiavelli had Machiavelli been available for consultation and not still several centuries away from being born. The Pope gestured dramatically to be interpreted as confession. "Observe how the accused refuses to deny these charges," Stephen announced to the court, with the triumph of a prosecutor who had just discovered an unbeatable legal loophole. His silence speaks louder than any protestation of innocence. Even in death, Formosus reveals his guilt through his stubborn refusal to answer for his crimes. Benedict found himself in the surreal position of trying to argue that his client's decomposition should be considered a mitigating circumstance rather than evidence of guilt. He pointed out that according to established church doctrine, the dead were beyond earthly judgment and had passed into God's hands for eternal evaluation. This theological point was both perfectly sound and completely irrelevant to Stephen Veit's purposes, which had long since departed from any fixed sound. As the trial progressed, Stephen Veit began presenting his evidence with the methodical precision of a prosecutor who had been building his case for months. He produced documents allegedly proving that Formosus had illegally transferred from his previous bishopric, violating the canonical provision against Pishut. Most damning of all, Stephen Veit produced correspondence between Formosus and various European rulers, arguing that these letters proved the dead pope had engaged in treasonous negotiations with enemies of the legitimate imperial authority. Each piece of evidence was presented to the corpse as if expecting a response, with Stephen Veit pausing dramatically to defend himself. When no defence was forthcoming, a circumstance that surprised absolutely no one, except possibly Stephen Veit himself, the Pope would nod sagely and declare that silence confirmed guilt. Benedict made increasingly desperate attempts to point out the logical inconsistency in these proceedings. His theological training had prepared him for many challenging pastoral situations, but defending a client whose most compelling argument was his obvious inability to commit perjury due to his complete lack of functioning vocal cords, was testing the limits of his ecclesiastical education. Yet none dared interrupt Stephen VI, who was clearly building towards some climactic moment of papal justice that would either vindicate his interpretation of divine law or confirm that their new pope had completely lost his grip on both reality and theological precedent. The trial was approaching its Stephen VI's eyes, the same gleam that hunters get when they've cornered their prey and are preparing for the final fatal blow. Stephen VI rose from his papal throne with the slow, deliberate movements of a predator who had been savouring this moment for 9 long months of careful planning. The assembled court fell silent as he approached Formosus's remains, his footsteps echoing through the marble hall like a countdown to some unspeakable conclusion. What happened next would transform Stephen VI from a merely vindictive pope into something far more monstrous, a cannibal who fed on both flesh and the very foundations of papal authority. The court finds Pope Formosus guilty of all charges, Stephen declared, his voice carrying the finality of a man who had never doubted the outcome of this grotesque proceeding. His ordinations are declared null and void, his papal acts rescinded, and his claim to the throne of St. Peter officially erased from church records. But Stephen VI wasn't finished with mere legal pronouncements. He gestured to his attendants, who stepped forward with tools that would have been more appropriate in a butcher shop than a papal court. The scholarly consensus suggests that what followed was both a literal and symbolic consumption of papal authority, though historians debate whether Stephen's actions were driven by political calculation or genuine psychological breakdown. Stephen VI personally stripped the papal vestments from Formosus's corpse, tearing away the sacred pallium and papal ring with movements that grew in creepily papal vestments. He threw the papal tiara to the marble floor where it rolled across the stones like a golden skull seeking escape from the madness unfolding around it. But the ritual humiliation of his predecessor's remains was merely the appetizer for Stephen's main course of revenge. He ordered his attendants to begin dismembering Formosus's corpse, starting with the 3 fingers of his right hand that had been used for papal blessings. These digits, dried and preserved by 9 months of decay, were severed with ceremonial knives, while Stephen VI recited a litany of curses against his predecessor's memory. Then came the moment that would earn Stephen VI his place in history's gallery of ecclesiastical cannibals. He lifted the severed fingers to his mouth and began to consume them with the ritualistic deliberation of someone partaking in a dark communion service. The assembled bishops and cardinals watched in horror as their pope literally devoured the blessed digits of his predecessor, chewing the ancient flesh while proclaiming that he was cleansing the Church of Formosus's corruption by absorbing it into himself. Some witness later claimed that Stephen VI's consumption of papal flesh culpite, whether these accounts reflect genuine supernatural events or the traumatized imaginations of nobles who had just watched their spiritual leader commit acts of cannibalism, remains a subject of scholarly debate. Stephen VI's feeding frenzy didn't end with Formosus's fingers. He ordered portions of the corpse to be prepared and served to members of his inner circle, transforming the papal court into a grotesque band served to members of his inner circle, transforming the papal court into a grotesque banquet. Cardinals who refused to participate in this cannibalistic communion found themselves facing accusations of disloyalty, while those who complied were rewarded with positions of increased authority within Stephen's increasingly deranged administration. The irony wasn't lost on the more theologically educated. Stephen VI was essentially creating a reverse Eucharist, where instead of consuming the body of Christ for temporal power, this blasphemous inversion of sacred ritual would later be cited by his enemies as evidence that Stephen VI had been possessed by demonic forces rather than motivated by mere political ambition. But Stephen's reign of cannibalistic terror extended Formosus's remains. He began systematically hunting down anyone who had supported his predecessor, and those unfortunate enough to be captured found themselves facing a fate that made simple execution seem merciful by comparison. Stephen VI had apparently developed a taste for human flesh during his consumption of Formosus, and he began incorporating cannibalism into his standard methods of dealing with political enemies. Cardinals who had endorsed Formosus's controversial decisions were invited to dinner parties that ended with them becoming the main course. Bishops who had performed ordinations under the previous pope found themselves literally consumed by Stephen's appetite. The Vatican kitchens, which had once prepared simple meals for contemplative clergy, were transformed into something resembling a medieval torture chamber, where human flesh was prepared with the same care once reserved for communion bred Stephen-Viite's household staff, bound by oaths of loyalty and terror of their own consumption, became accomplices in a reign of cannibalistic terror that turned the Holy See. Yet even as Stephen-Viite fed on his enemies with increasing abandon, the very brutality of his methods was sowing the seeds of his own destruction. Rome's noble families, who had initially supported his rise to power, began to realize that a pope who literally consumed his opposition might eventually develop an appetite for anyone who posed even the slightest threat to his authority. The city's political elite started meeting in secret, whispering about the need to stop Stephen-Viite before his cannibalistic purges decimated what remained of Rome's ecclesiastical and political leadership. They had created a monster, and now that monster was threatening to devour the very system that had brought him to power. Stephen-Viite, drunk on both literal and metaphorical consumption of his enemies, remained oblivious to the growing conspiracy against him. He continued his reign of cannibalistic terror, believing that fear would guarantee his security, never realizing that sometimes fear becomes so overwhelming that it transforms into desperate courage. The summer of 897 brought with it an oppressive heat that seemed to mirror the fevered madness gripping the papal court, where Stephen-Viite continued his cannibalistic reign with the oblivious confidence of a predator who had forgotten that even apex hunters can become prey. His transformation from vindictive pope to literal consumer of human flesh had reached such grotesque heights that even Rome's notoba. The conspiracy against Stephen-Viite began in the shadows of the city's most ancient churches, where terrified nobles and clergy gathered to whisper about their cannibalistic pope with the hushed tones normally reserved for confessing mortal sins. Cardinal Sergius, who had managed to avoid Stephen's dinner invitations, remarked as the unlikely leader of what historians would later call the anti-cannibalistic coalition. The scholarly debate continues over whether this resistance movement was motivated by genuine moral outrage or simple self-preservation, though the distinction becomes somewhat academic when faced with a pope who had turned episcopal appointments into literal feeding opportunities. Sergius understood that conventional political opposition would be insufficient in the most literal sense possible. Instead, he began spreading rumors throughout Rome that Stephen-Viite's cannibalistic practices had attracted the attention of supernatural forces, and that demonic entities were using the Pope's unholy appetite to gain influence within the Church itself. These whispers found fertile ground among a population already traumatized by months of watching their spiritual leader commit acts that violated every principle of Christian doctrine and basic human decency. The turning point came when Stephen-Viite made the fatal mistake of inviting several prominent Roman senators to what he described as a reconciliation feast, designed to heal the growing rift between the papal court and the city's secular authorities. The senators, who had heard enough disturbing rumours about papal dinner parties to approach this invitation with considerable trepidation, arrived at the Vatican to find a fair, but carried the unmistakable aroma of something far more sinister. Stephen-Viite, his appetite apparently sharpened by months of human consumption, personally served his guests portions of what he proudly announced was the flesh of those who dared oppose papal authority. The senators, realizing they were being invited to participate in cannibalistic communion or risk becoming the next course, then penned instruction while secretly planning their host's immediate destruction. One of them, Senator Marcus Tusculus, later described the evening as dining with a devil who wore papal robes and served damnation with every course. The conspirators left Stephen-Viite's cannibalistic banquet with empty stomachs, but renewed determination to end the Pope's reign before Rome's entire political and religious leadership disappeared into his digestive system. They spent the following weeks carefully orchestrating a popular uprising, spreading stories throughout the city about Stephen-Viite's unholy practices and positioning themselves as the righteous liberators who would save Rome from its cannibalistic pontiff. The revolt began on a sweltering August morning when crowds of Roman citizens, armed with whatever weapons they could find and motivated by months of accumulated horror, stormed the papal palace, demanding Stephen Vites deconfined and most the papal pathos to majors. The Pope, who had grown accustomed to ruling through terror and apparently believed his cannibalistic reputation would protect him from popular uprising, was caught completely off guard by the speed and fury of the assault. His papal guards, many of whom had witnessed their leader's feeding habits firsthand, offered only token resistance before abandoning their posts and leaving Stephen VI to face the mob's justice alone. The crowd found him in his private chambers where he was reportedly preparing for another cannibalistic meal, with human flesh laid out on golden plates like some nightmarish parody of the Last Supper. The irony of Stephen VI's final moments wasn't lost on the more theologically educated members of the mob. Here was a pope who had literally consumed his enemies, being torn apart by the very people he had tried to rule. Through fear and hunger, his death was swift but brutal, with the crowd apparently deciding that someone who had spent his papacy eating human flesh deserved to experience what it felt like to be consumed by others. The aftermath of Stephen VI's murder revealed the true extent of damage his cannibalistic reign had inflicted on papal authority itself. The Church found itself facing questions that medieval theology was utterly unprepared to address. What happens to papal infallibility when the Pope commits acts of cannibalism? How could the spiritual authority of the Vatican be restored after it had been literally transformed into a charnel house? The new Pope, Romanus, spent his brief 4-month reign attempting to purify the papal, replacing dishes, and having the entire Vatican blessed by teams of exorcists who worked day and night to cleanse the Holy See of what having the Antanachus. But Stephen VI's most lasting legacy wasn't the physical contamination of papal property. Was the precedent he had established for posthumous papal revenge. Holy popes would remember that death offered no protection from ecclesiastical justice, and that the grave could be violated in service of political nestedus. The Cadaver Synod became a template, inspiring later pontiffs to creative acts of posthumous punishment, though while never again reaching Stephen VI's levels of literal cannibalism, would continue to blur the lines of its spotlight. Even today, historians studying the medieval papacy point to Stephen VI's reign as the moment when the Church's spiritual mission became permanently entangled with the kind of political brutality that would define Vatican politics for St. Peter's Basilica, where the remains of countless popes lie in marble silence. Visitors sometimes repile, catching the faint aroma of something unspeakably foul, a lingering reminder of the summer when a cannibalistic pope turned the Holy See into a house of horrors. The scholarly consensus suggests that Stephen VI's transformation from political schemer to literal consumer of human flesh represents one of history's most complete moral breakdowns within religious authority, though some historians argue that his actions were simply the logical extreme of papal power. As the gentle centuries have passed and Rome has rebuilt its reputation as a centre of Stephen VI, has faded into the kind of whispered legend that parents use to frighten children into good behaviour. But late at night, when the Vatican's ancient stones seem to echo with voices from centuries past, some visitors claim they can still hear the sound of Stephen VI's appetite, forever gnawing at the foundations of papal authority, like a hunger that can never quite be satisfied. So sleep well tonight, knowing that your dreams are safer than the nightmares of medieval Rome, where even death of St. Peter once became a feeding chair for history's most cannibalistic pontiff. Let the gentle darkness carry you away from these ancient horrors into peaceful rest where no papal shadows can reach, and where the only consumption you need fear is the sweet surrender of consciousness to sleep's merciful embrace.